Photographs of the last Russian imperial court show gold braid, jeweled tiaras, and banquet tables set for hundreds of guests. Empress Alexandra Feodorovna's actual breakfast looked nothing like that. Most mornings, in a private wing of the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, she woke late, ate very little, and did most of it alone in her own rooms. This is what her breakfast consisted of, who prepared it, and why it took that particular form, based on the household's own records, the diary entries of Nicholas II, and the written accounts of the women who lived and worked alongside her. The Alexander Palace was not the grandest imperial residence near St. Petersburg. The nearby Catherine Palace, with its gilded halls and enormous grounds, had been built for state ceremony. Nicholas and Alexandra chose the smaller Alexander Palace as their home almost as soon as he became Tsar in 1894, since it offered more privacy and less exposure to court society. It remained their main residence for the rest of the reign. One detail about the building matters more than most others for this topic. The Alexander Palace had no dedicated dining room. Meals were set up wherever they were needed on a given day. Large or formal meals were laid out in the semicircular hall. Smaller, private meals for the family alone were taken in the palasander drawing room, also known as the Rosewood Room, or in Alexandra's own corner reception room. None of the food was cooked inside the palace itself. The kitchens, the palace bakery, and the confectionery were housed in a separate building a few hundred feet away on Palace Street. In 1902, workers dug a tunnel connecting that kitchen building directly to the palace, so staff could carry trays and dishes indoors instead of across open ground in bad weather. The kitchen staff, working under a French head chef named Cubat, numbered around 150 people, with another 20 in the confectionery alone. Out of that entire operation, only about 10 cooks were assigned exclusively to the immediate imperial family, apart from the staff handling state dinners and holiday feasts. Each member of the family had breakfast served privately in their own rooms rather than gathering together first thing in the morning. A servant asked what the person wanted to drink: coffee, tea, or cocoa. Bread and butter came as standard. Ham and eggs could be requested if wanted. For most mornings, that was the full extent of it, a plain tray rather than a laid table. Waking itself followed a fixed household ritual. The imperial bedroom could only be reached by passing first through the palasander room and then the mauve room, so the couple's entire morning, from waking to breakfast to the coffee that followed, took place inside this same small sequence of connected rooms in the private wing of the palace. Each morning a servant knocked at the door on the mauve room side, and on the other side a lackey struck the door 3 times with a small silver mallet, a signal that dated back to the reign of Catherine the Great and continued without change until the Revolution. Nicholas was usually up well before that signal came, already dressed in his robe and on his way to his own bathroom across the corridor. Alexandra slept badly and was often awake for much of the night, something those close to her attributed to constant worry. A tray of fruit and crackers was left on a side table every evening in case she grew hungry in the dark. Behind her bed hung a wall of icons centered on a copy of the Feodorovsky Mother of God, the same icon associated with the blessing of the first Romanov Tsar, lit by 2 dove-shaped lamps that burned continuously on rose oil for 21 years without being put out until the day the family left the palace for exile in August 1917. A small chapel stood beside the bed, where Alexandra prayed for long stretches, mostly for her son's health and her husband's safety, and where the family's priests came to hear confession. When she did finally rise, her ill health often meant she went no further than the sofa placed in front of the bed. The bedroom itself had a history that connected to Alexandra's own family before she ever arrived in Russia. Decades earlier, her mother, Princess Alice, had visited these same rooms when they formed part of a suite prepared for a family wedding, the marriage of Alexander II's daughter to Queen Victoria's son, the Duke of Edinburgh. When Alexandra took over the space after her own marriage, she chose to keep most of the 19th century furniture rather than replace it, having it repainted white instead of ordering new pieces, since she disliked spending money on redecoration she considered unnecessary. Rising itself came late by design. Doctors had instructed Alexandra to stay in bed until well past the hour when the rest of the household was already at work, and she kept to that instruction for years. She used the extra hours for correspondence, going through personal and official letters without getting up, since the wakeful nights described above often meant her letters got written after midnight, rather than during the day. People who knew her described someone who never had enough time for everything she meant to do, even though her own doctors kept her schedule slower than everyone else's. People who worked closely with Alexandra generally described her as someone far more comfortable with one visitor at a time than with a room full of people. In a letter to a friend, she once explained that she needed to be alone with a single person to feel like herself, since she had never had the easy, witty conversation a crowd seemed to expect of her. This same discomfort around groups shaped how she used her mornings. Audiences and official visitors were seen one at a time rather than gathered together, and the small, quiet routine of breakfast alone in her rooms suited a personality that found large gatherings tiring rather than enjoyable. Getting dressed involved two women who served her personally for years: Maria Tudelberg, who was German, and Madeleine Zanotti, of Italian and English background. Both had come with Alexandra from Germany, both spoke English with her rather than Russian, and both refused the standard maid's uniform and lace cap, since they considered themselves companions rather than servants. Alexandra chose her outfits roughly a week ahead of time, based on her calendar, and received a written summary each day of the next day's plans so she could give final instructions on what to wear. She bathed and then dressed herself, even with staff available to do it for her. She changed clothes several times over the course of a day, something plain for the morning, something more formal once luncheon and afternoon tea arrived, and a full evening dress with jewelry for dinner, even on evenings when she and Nicholas ate completely alone. Despite a household staff large enough that a quarter of its number could have handled the work, Alexandra often did small tasks herself, rather than ring for the one servant assigned to that specific job, a habit remembered by people in her circle as typical of her. Household members who observed this routine over many years reached a similar conclusion. Despite the outward luxury of the court and the enormous sums spent on it, the family's actual daily comforts were often more limited than those of many ordinary well-off households. Old routines and unwritten rules limited what Alexandra could change, and even as Empress she could not simply decide to have breakfast differently from how it had always been done. She could not, for instance, enter a shop in St. Petersburg without causing comment, and for years it was considered unusual for her to walk to church accompanied only by her daughters rather than a formal escort. What reached her tray in the morning was shaped by a restricted diet that her doctors had set for her. Officially, she was recorded as vegetarian, and in practice, she avoided meat almost entirely. She also kept every fast on the Orthodox Church calendar, a faith she had converted to at her marriage, which meant that on fasting days even butter came off the table, replaced by dry rings of bread called baranki, plain rolls, or shelled nuts. Her meals were cooked and served apart from the rest of the family's food for this reason. By most accounts, she ate very little at any single sitting. She did not lose noticeable weight despite this, a detail some writers have linked to possible thyroid problems, though this remains speculation rather than a documented diagnosis. One item reached her table by personal preference rather than medical order: kalak, a ring-shaped white bread roll baked in Russia long before her time. Alexandra's favorite came from a bakery in Moscow owned by a man named Ivan Filippov. Filippov's kolache needed water from the Moscow River to get the right texture in the dough, so tanks of that water were shipped out to Tsarskoye Selo, and the court's own bakers used it to make the rolls fresh on site, serving them warm. Filippov's bakery was already famous across Russia by this point, supplying bread well beyond the court, and kalak itself was historically a more refined item within Russian baking, closer to festive or wealthier tables than to the plain rye bread eaten daily by most of the population. The same kalach appeared again in the afternoon, since Alexandra kept up the English custom of tea at 5 o'clock throughout her life, a habit from her childhood in the household of her grandmother, Queen Victoria. She took this tea with Nicholas, usually with a hot kalach and butter on the side, unless it happened to be a fasting day. Even the plain buns served at these afternoon teas followed an old pattern of the same kind that had been served to Empress Catherine more than a century earlier, one of many small routines the household never updated. Serving kalak at both the morning tray and the 5 o'clock tea meant one of the more distinctly Russian foods in the household appeared twice within a few hours of each other, inside a routine that was otherwise shaped mostly by English habits. The word breakfast inside this household did not point to one single meal. Beyond the small private tray taken alone in the morning, there was a second, much larger meal that court records also labeled breakfast, even though it was served around midday, and was, in practice, the main meal the family shared together. A surviving menu from September 9, 1907, gives a sense of what this later breakfast could include: barley soup with pickles, carrots, and peas, small savory pastries called pirozhki, a thick sauce of whipped salmon known as salmon mayonnaise, beef fillet with potatoes, rissoles made of chicken breast, pears cooked in sherry, and a pie filled with sweet rice porridge and lingonberries. This meal was closer to what most people today would call lunch, and it was the one at which guests, when present, were most likely to be entertained. The waiters who carried a meal like this one were chosen partly for height and good looks, dressed in ceremonial livery with white gloves and shoes designed not to slip, since they were expected to move quickly through the palace corridors with heavy trays. The most senior waiters were assigned permanently to one member of the family, and traveled with that person between residences. The table itself was set with silver from sets first presented by Catherine the Great to her provincial governors, china most often from a service known as the Gorbayev set, and crystal engraved with the Romanov coat of arms. On New Year's Day, this second, larger breakfast became even more elaborate. An early spread offered ham, bacon, and eggs alongside butter, bread, and kolache, and a second sitting at noon added a table of zakuski, including caviar, sturgeon, herring, small sandwiches, sausages, and hot ham. Court etiquette fixed both New Year sittings at exactly 50 minutes, timed and enforced by Count Benkendorf, and whatever food remained on the table when the 50 minutes ended went to the servants rather than back to the kitchen. Given Alexandra's restricted diet, none of this display changed how little she herself typically ate at this table, even on the days when it was set for her. Alexandra's health explains most of the restraint in both her diet and her schedule. She suffered from sciatica severe enough that she sometimes had to be moved around in a wheeled chair, and it ended her participation in sports or games after her marriage. She had loved riding, and had even ridden at the head of her own regiment of lancers during a review in 1903. But she gave up all forms of exercise not long after the birth of her son Alexei in 1904, as heart trouble developed. After 1905, she briefly returned to music, taking piano lessons with a Professor Quendinger, and voice lessons with a singing teacher named Iretskaya, hoping to sing duets with her daughters as they grew older. But her heart condition eventually forced her to give this up as well. She kept detailed private notes on her own symptoms, including headaches, back pain, leg pain, and chest pain, along with a personal numbered scale from 1 to 3 that she used to record how severe her heart trouble felt on a given day, according to historian Simon Sebag Montefiore, who examined her papers. She regularly took a heart medicine made from the Adonis vernalis plant to help regulate her pulse. She was constantly tired, slept poorly, and had swollen feet. Much of this was compounded by the private guilt she carried over having passed hemophilia to her only son, a source of lasting and well-documented anxiety for her. One of her ladies-in-waiting, Baroness Sophie Buxheveden, remembered her as naturally hot-tempered but rarely showing it, someone who might respond sharply to provocation and then privately worry for days afterward about having been short with someone who had likely already forgotten the moment. After breakfast, when her schedule allowed it, the family gathered for coffee in the room most associated with Alexandra personally, the mauve boudoir, sometimes called the lilac boudoir. According to an account repeated by people connected to the household, Alexandra gave the architect Roman Meltzer a branch of lilac, said to have been a gift from Nicholas, and asked him to match the room's colors to it. The walls were covered in mauve silk ordered specially from a supplier in Paris, and the furniture was painted ivory to match. Alexandra spent much of her day in this room, resting on a chaise lounge with lace pillows under her and a lace shawl over her legs, with a glass screen set up behind her to block drafts. since cold air worsened her health complaints. She kept up needlework while sitting there, a habit formed in childhood under Queen Victoria's influence, and she read heavily, favoring serious non-fiction, but also enjoying English novels alongside her daughters as they grew older. Cabinets in the room held her personal book collection, sheet music, drawing supplies, and board games for the children. Anna Virubova, Alexandra's closest friend in her later years, became such a regular presence at these morning and midday gatherings that her visits were treated as a fixed part of the household routine. By some accounts, a day without seeing the Empress left her genuinely upset. In the evenings, the whole family regularly met there again for tea, and on occasion, the room hosted small home concerts with singers from the St. Petersburg Opera, including Fyodor Chaliapin, performing for a private audience of the family and a small number of guests. During the Russo-Japanese War, and again during the First World War, the same room served a working purpose for part of each day, since it was where Alexandra received the leaders of the charitable organizations she funded and supported. Nicholas followed a different daily schedule than his wife on most mornings. He preferred to rise earlier, take a walk when weather allowed, and keep to simple food by personal choice rather than medical order: buckwheat kasha, a hot kalach with his coffee, and plain fare generally, despite having an empire's kitchen staff available to him. His own diary makes several plain references to breakfast taken in the semicircular hall on ordinary mornings, alongside notes about walks, correspondence, and time spent with his children. In one entry from May 1895, he noted that right after breakfast, he and Alexandra spent time choosing fabric samples and carpet designs for their new rooms in the palace, a small domestic task fitted into the same morning as the meal itself. When the whole family did eat breakfast or lunch together, the meal was often laid out in Alexandra's own corner reception room rather than a grander hall. Because that room held a fine woolen carpet, staff laid a waterproof canvas sheet over it first, to protect the weave from spilled food during the meal. The 5 children did not usually take breakfast with their parents at all. The 4 Grand Duchesses and their younger brother, the Tsarevich Alexei, had their own separate dining room on the second floor of the palace's eastern wing, run on a schedule set by tutors and nursery staff. Despite her health and her full calendar, Alexandra held to a daily personal visit to her children, regardless of how she felt on a given day, a routine noted specifically by one of her own ladies-in-waiting, who recorded that the Empress never skipped this visit for 9 straight years, whatever her own condition. When one of her companions or children fell seriously unwell, she was known to visit not just once a day, but several times, including at night, regardless of how tired she herself felt that morning. Much of what shaped Alexandra's morning came from her upbringing in England. After her mother died when Alexandra was 6, she spent much of her remaining childhood under the close influence of her grandmother, Queen Victoria, at the British court. The 5 o'clock tea tradition, kept without exception for the rest of her life, came from that period. So did her lifelong habit of keeping needlework in her hands while sitting with family, and her preference for serious books alongside the English novels she shared with her daughters. Staff at the Alexander Palace also noted that her 2 personal maids spoke English with her throughout their entire service, close to 20 years, and reportedly learned very little Russian in all that time. This entire private routine changed sharply once war began in 1914. Instead of rising late, Alexandra was up by 7 most mornings. She attended church, then changed into the plain gray uniform of a Red Cross nursing sister rather than one of her usual outfits, and traveled to a hospital near the palace with her 2 eldest daughters, Olga and Tatiana, along with her close friend Anna Virubova. There she took part directly in the physical work of caring for wounded soldiers, washing and bandaging injuries alongside trained nurses. She had part of the nearby Catherine Palace converted into a military hospital for this purpose, and by the end of 1914, she was the patron of around 85 hospitals operating in and around the capital. The long mornings of correspondence written in bed and the plain private tray brought into her rooms on doctor's orders were replaced by a schedule organized around other people's injuries instead of her own health complaints. That wartime routine did not last. In March 1917, facing revolution, Nicholas gave up the throne. The family was placed under armed guard inside the same Alexander Palace where they had lived privately for over 20 years. During the months of house arrest that followed, before the moves to Siberia began, the family kept elements of the same domestic pattern for as long as they were allowed to, taking meals together in rooms they had used for decades, even as guards now stood where household staff once had. They were eventually moved first to Tobolsk in Siberia and later to Ekaterinburg, where Alexandra, Nicholas, and their 5 children were killed in July 1918. The details described here, the late waking hour, the tray of tea, bread, and butter, the kalach from Filipov's bakery, and the coffee taken afterward in the mauve boudoir, were part of a private domestic life. That life ended along with the government it belonged to.